There was a time in history when speaking too boldly as a woman could land you in a hospital, not for crime, not for violence, but for talking too much. And the diagnosis had a name: hysteria. In today's world, speaking freely is often celebrated as confidence or leadership, but for centuries, a woman's voice was treated with deep suspicion. Expressing opinions, debating men, showing confidence in public spaces, or speaking passionately about politics, marriage, religion, or personal freedom could all be interpreted as signs of mental instability. What modern society would call assertiveness was once medical evidence of illness, and that illness was blamed not on the brain, but on the female body itself. The idea of hysteria did not begin as a tool of punishment. Its roots stretch back to ancient Greece. Early physicians like Hippocrates believed the uterus was capable of moving freely inside the body, drifting through the abdomen and chest. They claimed this caused emotional outbursts, anxiety, nervousness, fainting, and uncontrollable speech. Because only women had a uterus, hysteria became a gender diagnosis from the beginning. It framed female emotion as biological malfunction rather than human expression. As centuries passed, the wandering womb theory faded, but the belief remained: women were naturally unstable. During the Middle Ages, outspoken women were often labeled as possessed, sinful, or morally dangerous. By the 1700s and 1800s, superstition gave way to medicine, but the punishment stayed. Doctors now replaced priests as the judges of behavior. Instead of exorcism, women were prescribed confinement, sedation, and isolation. The 19th century marked the most aggressive medical control of women's behavior in recorded history. Industrialization transformed society. Women began working in factories, writing articles, organizing for political rights, and challenging their limited roles as silent wives and daughters. This sudden visibility unsettled male-dominated institutions. Medicine offered a convenient explanation: women were not protesting injustice, they were sick. Medical textbooks of the era listed symptoms of hysteria that sound eerily like basic personality traits: excitement, emotional expression, anger, ambition, public speaking, sexual curiosity, creativity, and talkativeness. A woman who spoke forcefully or refused submission could now be diagnosed. Once labeled, her words lost all credibility. Anything she said afterward was treated as a symptom, not a statement. Doctors across Europe and America promoted hysteria as one of the most common female illnesses. Some estimated that up to 25% of all women suffered from it at some point in their lives. That staggering number reveals the truth. Hysteria had become a flexible tool used to explain away any behavior society found uncomfortable in women. Treatment was rarely gentle. Many women were forced into bed for weeks or months under what became known as the rest cure. They were forbidden from reading, writing, speaking publicly, or engaging in intellectual activity. The goal was not healing, it was submission. Silence was framed as recovery. Hospitals, private asylums, and even family homes became places of quiet imprisonment. A father could send a daughter away. A husband could commit a wife. The legal system often accepted a doctor's word without question. Once diagnosed, escape was nearly impossible. The label followed women socially, legally, and professionally. What makes this history especially disturbing is that hysteria was considered legitimate science. Some of the most respected physicians of the time published case studies presenting outspoken women as medical curiosities. Their suffering was observed, recorded, and demonstrated to students as proof of disease. Speaking was not resistance, it was pathology. Yet even under such pressure, many women continued to speak. Some wrote in secret, others smuggled letters out of institutions. A few documented the cruelty of their treatment and exposed how medicine was being used as social control. Their voices, though suppressed, carried the seeds of the collapse of hysteria as a diagnosis. By the early 20th century, scientific advances began dismantling the theory. Studies proved there was no wandering womb, no female-only nervous disorder, no biological link between confidence and illness. The diagnosis slowly disappeared from medical manuals, but the damage had already been done to countless lives. And even after the word hysteria vanished, the mindset it created did not. By the early 1800s, medicine had gained enormous authority in society. Doctors were no longer just healers, they were arbiters of normal behavior. Their words could determine whether someone was healthy, insane, competent, or dangerous. And for women who spoke too freely, this new medical power became a silent weapon. At the center of hysteria's rise was the belief that women were governed by emotion rather than reason. Medical journals of the time described the female nervous system as delicate, easily overstimulated, and fundamentally unstable. Any behavior that challenged quiet obedience could be translated into proof of imbalance. Passion became excess, anger became disorder, confidence became delusion. Physicians began documenting case studies of women who debated their husbands, challenged authority figures, wrote political essays, or refused submissive marriages. Instead of engaging with their ideas, doctors interpreted their speech as symptoms. A woman's tone, posture, speed of speech, facial expression, and even breathing patterns were analyzed as medical data. Her words were no longer meaning, they were evidence. One of the most influential figures in this system was French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot. At Paris's Salpêtrière Hospital, he conducted public demonstrations of hysterical patients. Women were brought before crowds of students and physicians where their emotional reactions were induced and studied. These sessions were treated as scientific theater. What appeared to observers as distress was presented as biological dysfunction. The audience did not hear arguments, they saw pathology. Charcot's work spread across Europe and into the United States. Medical schools adopted similar teaching methods. Hysteria became not just a diagnosis, but a spectacle. The public absorbed the idea that expressive women were medically flawed. This belief filtered into courts, schools, churches, and households. In domestic life, the impact was devastating. A woman who argued too much could now be declared ill. A wife who questioned her husband's control over money could be described as unstable. A daughter who resisted marriage could be judged disordered. Once a physician confirmed hysteria, the family gained legal justification to restrict her movements, isolate her, or institutionalize her. The most common prescribed treatment was forced inactivity. Doctors believed thinking strained the female nervous system. They argued that intellectual work damaged reproductive organs and drained vitality. Women were banned from writing, studying, or engaging in debate. Their world was reduced to silence and dependency. If symptoms persisted, stronger measures followed. Some physicians used electrical stimulation on patients' bodies to reset nerves. Others performed surgical procedures involving the reproductive organs, believing physical alteration could correct emotional patterns. These interventions were rarely consensual. Consent was not considered necessary once the diagnosis had been applied. The medical language surrounding hysteria was cold and mathematical. Pain was reported as data. Fear was labeled a reaction. Resistance was described as clinical defiance. This vocabulary stripped women of moral authority over their own lives. They were no longer participants in society, they were specimens within it. What made this system especially dangerous was that it appeared progressive. It presented itself as science replacing superstition, but in reality it recycled old fears through new terminology. Where earlier generations accused outspoken women of witchcraft, modern society accused them of neurological instability. The mechanism changed, the outcome remained control. By mid-century, hysteria had become the most frequently diagnosed disorder among women in Western hospitals. The more society expanded public spaces for women, the more medicine expanded its reach to restrain them. Speech and sickness became intertwined, not by biology, but by fear of social change. Yet this medical authority was built on assumption, not proof. No biological marker for hysteria ever existed. No physical test could confirm it. The diagnosis lived entirely in interpretation, shaped by gender, power, and expectation. And as the voices of women became louder in public life, medicine responded not by listening, but by redefining speech itself as illness. Once hysteria became an accepted medical diagnosis, it did not remain confined to hospitals. It quietly became a legal instrument inside homes, marriages, and courtrooms. With a single medical opinion, a woman could lose her freedom, her reputation, and even her legal identity. What began as a medical label evolved into a foundation for control. In the 19th century, women in most Western societies had limited legal standing. Married women were often considered extensions of their husbands under the law. Property rights, financial independence, and even child custody were commonly controlled by men. Within this framework, a diagnosis of hysteria did more than identify illness, it removed credibility. A woman deemed hysterical was considered incapable of rational judgment. Her testimony could be dismissed, her decisions could be overridden, her resistance could be reframed as medical refusal rather than personal choice. Fathers used the diagnosis to discipline daughters who resisted arranged marriages or social expectations. Husbands used it to neutralize wives who questioned authority or exposed abuse. In many cases, institutionalization did not require a criminal charge. A medical certificate was often enough. Once admitted to a private asylum, some women vanished from public life for years. Inside these institutions, daily life was strictly controlled. Schedules dictated when women slept, ate, walked, and spoke. Letters were censored, visits were restricted. Any attempt to challenge confinement was recorded as a symptom of illness, further justifying detention. The system trapped women in a circular logic. Disagreement proved the diagnosis, and the diagnosis invalidated disagreement. The legal system reinforced this dynamic. In court cases involving divorce, inheritance, or custody, a woman's past diagnosis could be used against her, even if she had been discharged years earlier. Judges frequently accepted medical testimony without requiring physical proof. A woman labeled unstable was viewed as unreliable, regardless of the facts of her case. Employment was another casualty. Female teachers, writers, factory workers, and performers lost positions after being diagnosed. Employers feared liability and disorder. Some institutions explicitly barred women with any history of nervous illness. Economic independence disappeared overnight for many, forcing them back into dependence on families who had sometimes initiated the diagnosis in the first place. Newspapers played a powerful role in spreading stigma. Reports of hysterical episodes often appeared in scandal columns, describing female emotion as curiosities or warnings. These stories reinforced the belief that female expression was abnormal and dangerous. The public learned to associate a woman's visible emotion with instability, not injustice. Yet not every woman submitted silently. Some found ways to document their experiences. Personal journals, smuggled letters, and later memoirs reveal a pattern of institutional abuse hidden beneath clinical language. Women described being confined for reading too much, for disagreeing with religious instruction, for resisting marital demands, or for demanding control over their own earnings. One of the most tragic aspects of this era was how quickly community support could collapse. Once labeled hysterical, former allies often withdrew. Friends were warned to avoid reinforcing delusions. Relatives feared association. Isolation became both a symptom and a sentence. What made hysteria especially powerful as a silencing tool was that it did not require physical force in the traditional sense. The authority of medicine replaced chains with charts, locks with diagnoses. Resistance no longer had to be beaten, it could be documented away. And all of it rested on a single assumption, that a woman's voice, when raised too strongly, signaled biological failure rather than human will. Once a woman had been diagnosed with hysteria, treatment began immediately, and the goal was not dialogue or understanding. The goal was control. Medicine in the 19th century did not aim to ask why women spoke out. It focused entirely on how to make them stop. The most widely used method was known as the rest cure. Developed and promoted by American physician Silas Weir Mitchell, it was prescribed primarily to educated, outspoken, or professionally active women. The treatment required total isolation. Patients were confined to bed for weeks or months. They were forbidden from reading, writing, speaking at length, or engaging in any intellectual activity. Even brief conversations were discouraged. Food was strictly regulated. Movement was restricted. Thinking itself was described as dangerous. Mitchell believed that mental activity drained women's nervous systems and damaged their reproductive health. In his view, ambition and intelligence weakened femininity. The rest cure aimed to reverse this by breaking habits of independence. Many women reported that the isolation was more agonizing than physical pain. Some described losing track of time. Others experienced memory decline, panic attacks, and depression, symptoms that doctors then interpreted as proof that the illness was severe. Electrical stimulation was another popular intervention. Physicians applied electrical currents to different parts of the body in an attempt to calm nerves or reset emotional behavior. These procedures were experimental and often painful. There was no clear scientific mechanism explaining their benefit, but their use conveyed authority and deterrence. Patients learned that resistance would be met not with explanation, but with escalation. Gynecological surgery also became a favored solution. Some doctors believed hysteria originated in the ovaries or uterus. As a result, they performed invasive operations, including removal of reproductive organs, to correct emotional behavior. Thousands of women underwent irreversible procedures without clear consent. In many cases, surgery worsened both physical health and psychological trauma. Hydrotherapy, the use of cold or alternating water immersion, was another common practice. Patients were submerged in cold baths to shock the nervous system into submission. Prolonged exposure caused physical distress, and some women fainted during treatment. Again, reaction itself was noted as medical data rather than suffering. Institutionalized women faced even harsher conditions. Silence was enforced through strict discipline. Speaking without permission could result in solitary confinement. Emotional expression could lead to punishment. The goal was behavioral training disguised as therapy. The message was clear: compliance equaled recovery. Doctors recorded these treatments in clinical language that erased the lived experience of patients. Pain was described as stimulation. Fear became agitation. Collapse was labeled progress. Charts filled with observations, while the voices of the women themselves vanished from record. Yet despite the cruelty, many of these methods were celebrated as breakthroughs. Medical conferences praised efficiency. Journals published success rates. A woman who emerged quiet and obedient was considered cured, regardless of her inner condition. Emotional flattening passed as wellness. The contradiction was devastating. Treatment designed to heal often produced long-term damage.
muscle atrophy, chronic anxiety, internalized shame, and loss of identity. Many women left institutions unable to resume independent lives. Some never left at all. What medicine framed as care functioned instead as enforced disappearance. The physical body became the site where social obedience was reconstructed. A loud woman entered the system, a silent one was returned. And through it all, the diagnosis remained unquestioned, not because it was proven, but because it was useful.
Despite the power of institutions, not every woman accepted silence as fate. Some resisted quietly, others documented. A few challenged the system openly. Their voices, often dismissed in their own time, eventually became the evidence that dismantled hysteria as a legitimate diagnosis. One of the most important forms of resistance was writing. Even when forbidden from reading or holding a pen, many women found ways to record their experiences in secret. Some hid scraps of paper between mattress seams. Others memorized their thoughts and reconstructed them later. These accounts described the psychological devastation of forced isolation, the humiliation of being examined like objects, and the terror of losing legal identity overnight. Among the most famous was writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman. After being subjected to the rest cure for what doctors diagnosed as hysteria, she nearly lost her ability to think clearly. Instead of submitting permanently, she later wrote a short story based on her experience. That work exposed how enforced silence itself drove women into mental collapse. Though disguised as literature, it was a direct indictment of medical abuse. Many physicians recognized themselves in its pages, and not always comfortably. Outside literature, early women's rights activists also began to challenge medical authority. As suffrage movements gained strength in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, activists connected political suppression with psychiatric labeling. They argued that hysteria was not a disease, but a response to confinement, exclusion, and lack of autonomy. These arguments reframed women's emotional distress as social injury rather than biological defect. Some female physicians also began breaking ranks. As women slowly gained access to medical education, they brought different perspectives into diagnosis. They observed that male patients with similar symptoms were rarely labeled hysterical. Instead, men were diagnosed with stress, exhaustion, or trauma. The double standard became increasingly difficult to justify scientifically. Meanwhile, advances in neurology and psychology began to undermine hysteria's foundations. Researchers searched unsuccessfully for physical markers. No anatomical abnormality could consistently explain the wide range of behaviors attributed to the condition. Emotional expression proved universal across genders. The idea of a disease tied to the uterus became scientifically indefensible. Public opinion also began to shift. As women entered universities, professions, journalism, and politics, their visibility normalized what had once been labeled deviant. The same behaviors that had drawn diagnoses in private homes now appeared on public stages. The medical explanation collapsed under the weight of social change. World War I accelerated this process. When thousands of male soldiers returned with psychological trauma, doctors used many of the same terms once reserved for women. This forced medicine to confront an uncomfortable truth. Emotional breakdown was not female, it was human. By the 1920s and 1930s, the word hysteria began disappearing from serious medical literature. Diagnostic manuals changed. New categories replaced vague emotional judgments. But disappearance from textbooks did not mean disappearance from culture. The language of dismissal simply evolved. Even after official abandonment, the idea lingered in popular speech. Women were still called overly emotional, unstable, dramatic, or irrational. The authority of medicine had taught society to distrust female voices reflexively. Removing the diagnosis did not automatically remove the habit. Yet the women who resisted had accomplished something irreversible. They forced the world to confront how easily science could be shaped by power. They proved that silence could be imposed by institutions and that resistance could survive even under medical control.
And with that recognition, the medical monopoly over women's voices began to crack.
By the early 20th century, medicine stood at a crossroads. The scientific foundation that had once supported hysteria was crumbling. New tools, new research methods, and new social realities exposed how fragile the diagnosis had always been. What had once been treated as biological certainty now appeared increasingly like cultural invention wrapped in scientific language. One of the biggest blows came from neurology. As doctors began napping the brain with greater precision, hysteria failed every test of physical verification. There was no consistent lesion, no damaged nerve, no anatomical abnormality that could explain why millions of women had been labeled disordered for behaviors that now looked ordinary. The nervous system did not confirm the theory. The uterus did not explain the symptoms. Biology refused to cooperate with the narrative. At the same time, psychology emerged as a new field. Early psychologists reinterpreted emotional distress as the product of experience, environment, conflict, and trauma. Problems once blamed on wandering organs or female weakness were reframed as responses to stress, repression, and social limitation. This new lens made hysteria look dangerously simplistic. World events also shifted medical thinking. During World War I, large numbers of male soldiers developed what was then called shell shock. These men displayed paralysis, tremors, memory loss, emotional collapse, and uncontrollable fear, symptoms that medicine had previously labeled hysterical in women. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. If hysteria was female by nature, why were men now experiencing identical conditions under extreme stress? This forced medicine to confront its bias. Emotional breakdown was no longer framed as feminine instability. It was acknowledged as a human response to overwhelming conditions. The concept of gendered mental illness began to unravel. By the mid-20th century, hysteria was quietly removed from official diagnostic manuals. Psychiatry replaced it with specific categories such as anxiety disorders, conversion disorders, and depression. These new labels focused on symptoms rather than gender. The word that had once justified mass silencing faded from professional language. But although medicine abandoned the term, society retained the reflex. The cultural habit of dismissing women's speech as emotional excess did not disappear with the diagnosis. It simply mutated. Women in politics were labeled unstable. Women in workplaces were described as too sensitive. Women in relationships were told they were overreacting. The medical label was gone, but the social instinct remained. Media played a key role in preserving the tone. Films, television, and advertising repeatedly portrayed vocal women as irrational, traumatic, or destructive. These depictions reinforced old ideas without needing scientific endorsements. The audience no longer needed doctors to mistrust women's anger. Culture did the work automatically. Language also preserved the legacy. The word hysterical remained in everyday speech as a casual insult. Few people remembered its medical roots, but the gendered implications survived. To call someone hysterical was to echo centuries of authority used to discredit emotion and invalidate voice. Meanwhile, women's participation in public life expanded dramatically. They voted, governed, wrote laws, led businesses, and commanded armies. Their visibility contradicted every old medical assumption. Yet the resistance they faced followed familiar emotional patterns. Criticism often bypassed ideas and targeted temperament instead. What history shows is not just the fall of a diagnosis, but the endurance of a framework. When the system cannot argue with a woman's logic, it questions her stability instead. That pattern, established in clinics and asylums, migrated into commentary, headlines, and casual speech. Hysteria may be absent from textbooks now, but its influence never truly left the room. The story of hysteria did not end when the diagnosis vanished from medical books. Its influence simply shifted location. What was once enforced through hospitals and legal documents now operates through language, culture, and perception. The system no longer locks women away for speaking too boldly, but it still finds ways to weaken the impact of their voices. Today, women are no longer diagnosed with hysteria for expressing anger, ambition, or disagreement, yet the defensive reactions remain familiar. Public figures are described as too emotional. Professionals who speak forcefully are labeled difficult. Personal boundaries are framed as overreactions. The words have changed, but the strategy remains the same. When argument cannot be defeated with logic, it is dismissed through character. This is the deepest legacy of hysteria, not the diagnosis itself, but the cultural reflex it trained into society. For centuries, authority taught people that a woman's emotional expression was a medical problem rather than a social response. That idea sank into education, family structures, courtroom behavior, entertainment, and everyday conversation. Even without realizing it, modern language still echoes that training. What makes this history especially important is how cleanly it exposes the relationship between power and science. The physicians who promoted hysteria were not operating in a vacuum. Their theories aligned perfectly with the social order of their time. The diagnosis justified male authority in homes, politics, law, and education. It created a system where disagreement could be neutralized without debate. And this is where the lesson becomes universal. Hysteria shows how easily institutions can turn opinion into illness when power feels threatened. It shows how language can be transformed into evidence. It shows how authority can be protected by redefining resistance as breakdown. This pattern is not limited to one gender or one century. It repeats wherever control is challenged and discourse becomes inconvenient. The women who endured this system were not simply victims of flawed medicine. They were casualties of a society unable to tolerate equal voices. Many lost years of life, some lost their families, some lost their sense of self, and most were never publicly vindicated. History moved on while their records remained sealed under clinical terms that disguised injustice as care. Yet the collapse of hysteria also proves something else. False authority is never permanent. The diagnosis fell not because the powerful surrendered control willingly, but because truth accumulated until the system could no longer defend itself. Science corrected itself only after countless lives had already been damaged. That pattern, too, repeats across history. Today, we inherit both outcomes, the progress and the residue. We no longer call outspoken women sick, but we still debate how much space their voices deserve. We still argue about tone instead of substance. We still measure expression differently depending on who is speaking. And this leaves us with the real question that history places in front of us. If you had lived in the era when women were diagnosed with hysteria for speaking too boldly, would you have chosen silence for safety or speech knowing the cost? And just as importantly, in today's world, whose voices do we still question first when power feels uncomfortable?